All right, so we're going to talk about a place that's very, very famous in New Orleans. It's called Preservation Hall. If you've ever been to New Orleans, you've been there, because if you've been to New Orleans, you've been to that French Quarter. Don't deny it, you've been there. That's right. And if this was the early part of the 20th century, you probably would have gone to Storyville too, because I know who you are. Oh yes, I do. But this was in the French Quarter, okay? And the building has an old history, goes back to really early 1800s, and there were a couple of fires and that kind of thing, and the original building burned down. Then there was a vacant lot, and then part of it was restored and used as a office and lab for a photographer. By the 50s, we have a art gallery called Artists Association that's being managed by Larry Borenstein. And his idea, in order to attract more customers to his art gallery, was to have musicians playing out front. This was a very informal relationship because he wasn't really paying musicians. He was just giving the privilege of playing on his property for whatever tips they could collect. The problem is the musicians were attracting more customers for themselves and collecting more tips than he was selling art. People like food in New Orleans, and they like the music. So these musicians started doing pretty well. And I think this kind of bothered him a little bit, I don't know. At any rate, a young couple on their honeymoon comes through from Pennsylvania, Alan Joffrey and his wife Sharon. And they're hanging out in New Orleans, and they love the sound of the music, the jazz, and they're hanging out in the French Quarter. And he was a tuba player. He actually had a degree from the Wharton School of Business. And they're hanging around in New Orleans, and they're continuing to come by this art gallery just to give tips and support the musicians. And Borenstein is like, how would you guys like to manage this? Well, they hadn't thought about it. They still had a home in Pennsylvania, but they quickly agreed. They loved New Orleans. They loved the music. He had a business degree. Why not? So somewhere around 1961, they came by and took it over and started managing it not as a art gallery, but as a jazz gallery, a place to preserve the music. They even had a 501c dedicated to preserving traditional New Orleans music. And they did something different. They hired musicians and paid them a salary. Most of the musicians who were authentic New Orleans jazz musicians, who by this time were aged 60 to 90. So a lot of these musicians would have been playing when Louis Armstrong, as a young man, was walking the streets of New Orleans, and when so many others, Joe Oliver was there, and Mr. Jelly Lloyd was walking the street and doing his thing. These guys were the real deal. And so their music was quite authentic and quite historical. And this attracted people in droves. Now at first, they didn't do any advertising. The music advertised itself. There was no amplification, because let's face it, there was no amplification in 1910, 1920. They kept it real. But from 1961 to 1963, the popularity of this new venture, known as Preservation Hall, grew so much that these elder statesmen of jazz could actually go on tour, not just in America, but around the world. Because you see, New Orleans attracts people from around the world, and when people would come by and hear this, they would spread the word, and then there became a demand from wherever they were from to bring this group here. Let me hear them. Let's go to France. Let's go to Belgium. Let's go to Holland. Let's go to England. Let's go. So by 1963, Mr. Joffrey is actually touring with his Preservation Hall house band. The original musicians hired, the guys in their 60s and 90s who had been in New Orleans their whole lives, got to go on tour. The first time for many of them, or the second time because they hadn't been anywhere for 40, 50 years, except New Orleans. They're touring all over America, and since New Orleans attracts tourists from all over the world, they are under demand to come to France, to England, to Holland, and they're going to Italy, and they're touring and having a good time. And of course, Mr. Joffrey and his wife, they're traveling with these musicians, supporting the expansion of jazz, preserving traditional New Orleans jazz. I did not say Dixieland, I said traditional New Orleans jazz, and financing a good retirement for these elder statesmen, musicians of the New Orleans jazz tradition. This continues to this very day. Not only do they have that 501c, not only do they have the live performances at Preservation Hall itself, they even have their own record label. So this was a very, very successful venture for the Joffreys, and it made the Wharton School of Business look good, at least in this case. You'll get that joke on the way home. So now, say thank you to the Joffreys for seeing the wisdom of preserving traditional New Orleans jazz and giving it a home in the middle of the French Quarter in a place that used to be only for art, that is now Preservation Hall for the preservation of traditional New Orleans jazz. Thank you so very much. I hope you've enjoyed this. Oh yeah, it all started in 1961. All right, the jazz did anyway, baby.